All right. Well, I'm glad you all are having a nice chat. Thank you for joining us today. It's so great to see so many people who came out to view the exhibit as a community and then joined us for a conversation afterwards. So welcome, everyone. My name is Lisa Carter. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Vice Provost for Libraries and University Librarian here at UW-Madison. This opportunity to talk was made possible by our Friends of the Libraries organization, which is a group of volunteers who are passionate about highlighting the work of the libraries and showcasing areas where we are crucial partners to student achievement, faculty support, and scholarly research. Tonight, the spotlight is on our university, our UW Archives, and all the work that went into supporting the Public History Project. We're grateful to the Friends for giving us this platform and encourage any of you who might be interested in getting involved to consider volunteering with the Friends. You can also donate books or give a gift to Friends so that they can continue their work. Links to information about the Friends will be included in the follow-up email that you'll receive when tonight's recording is available. So speaking of this, as you can probably tell, we're having tonight's conversation professionally recorded so that those of us who are unable to attend tonight could also benefit from the conversation. So while we expect to have an open and honest conversation tonight, do keep in mind that your comments will be recorded. And I hope everybody signed in at the door. That sign-up sheet does operate as our release form and documents your consent. So just letting you know what's going on. We are going to begin by briefly introducing ourselves. Actually, I think I'm doing the introductions. And then we'd like to hear a little bit more about your impressions of the exhibit, what struck you as particularly impactful, perhaps what you learned or were surprised about. And then I think your reflections may shape some of our comments. I also hope that we'll bring up some challenging aspects to consider about archival work and research. And then we'll come back after we make a few comments to your questions about anything to be in dialogue with you. So just sort of letting you know the format is I'm gonna do introductions. This is your warning to think about what you'd like to share about your impressions. And then we're going to talk about that for a little while, and then we're going to make some other comments, and then we'll come back and do questions. So with the introductions, as I said, I'm currently the Vice Provost for Libraries here at UW-Madison, but I started out my career as an audiovisual archivist, and I did that for about 12 years. That archival practice is slightly different than straight-up archives work, but it does mean that I hung around with the archivists professionally. I went to the Society of American Archivists conferences, and increasingly, as I took on increasing responsibility, I then found myself overseeing university archives and people who were doing archival work. And I learned a lot from university archivists that I worked with about archival practice. So joining me in this panel discussion today is Troy Reeves, who is the oral historian at the UW-Madison Archives and Records Management Unit over in Steenbach Libraries. He's served in that role since June 2007. And in this role, he has overseen the key components of managing an oral history program, collecting and curating oral history recordings, as well as communicating and collaborating with interested individuals about the art and science of oral history. And he also trains partners in doing oral histories. He has managed dozens of oral history projects, including Madison LGBTQ Community, 1960s through the present, Women at UW, Women Inspire, and African American Athletes at UW. He has also held many leadership roles in the Oral History Association, including 6 years as Oral History Review's managing editor, and starting in October 2022, a 4-year term on its executive council. Troy's remarks today are going to be framed primarily from his oral history role within the university archives and his program's collaboration with the public history program. And of course, our panel would not be complete without Kacie Lucchini Butcher, who is an award-winning public historian whose work is dedicated to building empathy and advocating social justice. She is currently the director of the UW-Madison Public History Project, a multi-year effort to uncover and give voice to the histories of discrimination, exclusion, and resistance on campus. The project's premier exhibition, Sifting and Reckoning, is currently on display at the Chazen until December 23rd. So if you didn't get a chance to do that today, please get over there. And then if you need to get back, because it's a lot of content to take in, you can do that until December 23rd. It is accompanied by a digital exhibit, a public lectures series, and curricular materials that allow the Madison community to reckon with this history. Kacie and her staff and the students worked closely with UW-Archives staff to bring Sifting and Reckoning to life. Between long research days, exhibitions, sneak peeks, oral history interviews, the digitization of archival materials, and so much more, it was a true partnership between the project and the University Archives. And so she wants to acknowledge the Public History Project is indebted to the expertise at the University Archives. So with those introductions, we'd like to start by hearing your thoughts and impressions of the exhibit. We have a mic being run, so Libby's assisting us, and she's gonna run a mic. So we wanna hear what struck you, maybe what surprised you, what kind of reflections did you have? Libby has a microphone that we're asking you to use both for accessibility and for the recording. We'd like to consider your feedback as we provide our panel comments. Thank you.
Do you want us to identify who we are?
Sure.
My name is Alan Ginsberg. I've been associated with the university here for 48 years as a student, as a lecturer, as a patron. So going through the exhibit just now, I thought was very eye-opening. I knew about the more current history of racism and sexism, that is occurring on the university campus. It was interesting to see how far back it goes, and also, kudos to the university for, allowing is probably not the best word to use, but having a lot of firsts about, women and Jews and blacks and Hispanics, as early as back into the 1800s or so. But what also struck me is how currently many of the same issues that were being dealt with back in the late 1800s and early 1920s, 30s, 40s through now are still occurring at the university here. One of the things that kind of strikes me is that it seems like the administration here still has difficulty balancing freedom of speech with curtailing hate speech. Where is the line between freedom of speech and where is the line to stop hate speech? And I think that's something that the university still needs to work on, I guess. And I could name many events within the last couple of years that show the events around the Jewish holidays when some anti-Semitic chalk was written about, the football game a couple of years back when the student had the noose around his the masked Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton caricature there. But anyway, just a few thoughts. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sally Leong. I'm faculty emeritus from the Department of Plant Pathology on campus. And thank you for doing such an outstanding job. It's just really a wonderful. I'm a half Asian. My father was Chinese and my mother was a Caucasian. And so I came here in the 1980s, early 80s. And so as one of the first women faculty members and also a person of color, I've been identified as a person of color throughout my career on campus. So it was very interesting and I've been involved, or was involved with a lot of diversity activities before my retirement. So it was interesting to hear and to see, rather, this extended so early in the beginning of the institution and even in the acquisition of the land that eventually became the university property. It's a very sad story, but progress has been made, but I do agree with the last speaker that much has to be done, and I hope that this exhibit might be shared across the state with especially with grade school children and K through 12. In other campuses, I don't know if there's a pop-up way of moving it around, but I do think it's a very informative and necessary to educate the entire state. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think Kacie might speak to this, but there is an accompanying website, and it has those stories, all the stories that you saw and more. So that is one way where, Kacie's team is making sure that access to those stories is broader than people who can travel here. Libby, I think there's a hand in the back. Oh, and
since
Maria.
the mic is here, could I
Yes,
just
okay, sure, go
ask
ahead.
a question? My name is Maria Safiotti Dale. I'm a retired academic staff member here at the university. And I was just wondering how you decided which categories of underrepresented groups you included in the exhibition and more generally in your project. So that's just something to think about.
Let's hold on to that one, yeah, because you might address that actually. Yeah. Yeah. Let's do one or two more, and then maybe we'll get to our comments.
I'm Sam. I'm an alum and an employee. I was just really struck by how the exhibit seemed to crash the past into the present. It can be so hard when you're living through things to know what events are significant, which things are just day to day. And so when you walk through a curated exhibit, when you see things from hundreds of years ago, you assume the curator picked these things out because these were the significant things. So to see events that some of us were around for reflected back at us, like I remember sitting at my desk when Denzel McDonald was arrested in class and the tweets coming in and the chills that we had. And I got that chill feeling back walking through. So it's just a reminder to pay close attention to those sensations as events are unfolding. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Pete Bowl, and I'm a librarian here at Memorial. What struck me was the statement about how the administration professes commitment to diversity in hiring and recruiting, and how actually difficult that is to put into practice, and how that can be addressed and improved. Being on a few recent search committees, I understand firsthand that difficulty, and I'm glad that they brought that up in the exhibit.
And we had another hand right in front of you, Pete.
Hello, my name is Linda Tuckman Ginsburg. I'm a 3-time alumni and an emeritus academic staff, so lots of history here. And, I'm thinking about the history of the university as being a very hierarchical, male-dominated institution historically, and I think some of that was highlighted in the exhibit. It was only men, and then, who could be in charge. And so I thought there was an interesting overlay between sort of the type of positions and advancement and working through a hierarchical organization. And I was trying to think of, so are we less hierarchical that makes some of those glass ceilings more approachable? Or, I just think that whole concept of, faculty is king of the top, and so to speak. So I was just thinking about that and diversity.
Yeah, that's actually a really good segue into some of the things that I wanted to highlight in my remarks. So I think maybe we'll do that and then come back. So if you didn't have a chance to enter your insights, please bring those into the Q&A portion, and we'll get back to some of the things you all brought up. So thank you very much for those insights. I'm going to start with some thoughts about the nature of archives, because we do want to focus on the archives today. And then I'm going to pass it to Troy for comments about how oral history fits into that, and then over to Kacie to speak from the researcher, user's point of view. And then we'll get back to questions. So I wanted to start with some definitions. I'm a librarian, I'm going to do that. According to, and I mentioned the Society of American Archivists before, but according to the Society of American Archivists Dictionary, public history is the use of historical skills, methods, and interpretation to make history relevant and useful outside academia.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good definition. Useful is really the key word there. Right. Useful, I like that.
Right. So Sifting and Reckoning is really a public history project meant specifically, as Kacie has educated us, to share history with the public and engage the community in thinking deeply about history to help us understand ourselves and our context, our current context better. There's an emphasis on the usefulness of historical knowledge and on history's presentation, and I would argue a great deal of public history work is really storytelling and the ability of the public to consider and reframe their own stories. And I probably learned that from Kacie. Going back to the SAA dictionary, a university archives is best defined by the 5th and 6th definitional meaning entries, which describes archives as the division within an organization responsible for acquiring and maintaining the organization's records of continuing value, institutional archives, and the official repository of an institution's record of continuing value. So archival practice then is really dictated by the nature of the institution and its records. University archives are primarily created by an organization's records management practices, which are often governed by, especially when it's a public institution, the state's records program or records schedule. The institution, and also what the institution itself thinks it should be keeping. At their base, a university archives is funded by an institution to document and maintain the institution's formal, and one might say sanctioned history. So this is where we get back to the traditional hierarchy, whiteness, male-dominated higher education tradition. This often means that the public land grant research-intensive institutions that create archives that are traditionally meant to capture the stories of whiteness, privilege, and patriarchy. The purpose of a university archives is aligned with documenting a dominant culture, to document an institution that by its very nature situates privilege with the dominant culture and benefits from gatekeeping, really, in the forms of hiring, admitting students, and granting tenure. So the Sifting and Reckoning project really calls on us to reckon with our history, which, as a librarian and archivist, also requires reckoning with the very nature and purpose of a university's archive. And so that's really important and one of the core of the conversation I want to have today. Several aspects of archival practice impact what history gets documented and is made available for use by the institution itself, as well as to researchers such as public historians who seek to engage the public with history. So I want to talk about some aspects of archival practice. So it's going to get kind of geeky librarian-y on you. But if an university archives is at its base an accumulation of records of the business of the university, the bulk of the collection then represents the formal activities of the university. So meeting minutes, reports, university publications, departmental records, things like that. And then given that this is the primary responsibility of the archives, the reason it's actually funded, it requires an extra commitment and purposeful attention to purposely enhance the picture of a university's history. So this is where we get into what do we acquire anyway? How do we acquire things? And so acquisition happens through the record schedule and then by purposeful action after that. Archivists have known for a really long time that an organization's records based on the schedule don't tell the whole story, and we accent that with other materials, such as oral histories, alumni collections, student organization collections, and artifacts. Additionally, we need to consider that some communities do not want their stories documented at an institution where they didn't feel welcomed. So archivists are in the business of rebuilding relationships, developing trust, and making long-term commitments as collection stewards. And this purposeful work is really necessary, but it's not always recognized as an essential feature of a university archives by the broader organization. In addition to tackling these issues, archivists have long considered how archival practice needs to change. So this is a critical balance, considering that the mission of the University Archives is to document the institution. It's still to document that history, but also we're making a purposeful shift in framing what has, a purposeful shift in framing has been made here. The institutional history also includes the experiences of people who spent formative years at the institution and their stories, which you've seen in the exhibit. So that's one aspect, is how do we acquire things? How do we select them? How do things end up in the archives? And then there's the matter of description and preservation. So getting a collection into the archives is not in itself enough. As primary sources, the materials in an archive is not discoverable if it's not effectively described. Our university archives years ago, before the current staffing model, had been resourced primarily for answering questions. And what that means is that when this project approached the archive, staff were working from a position of not having a great deal of the collection described and processed. So this meant that the project required a great deal of staff mediation, as the researchers were not able to be self-sufficient due to the lack of EAD finding aids. So EAD is encoded archival description. In fact, the public history project staff, as part of their work, helped create descriptions that we'll be using for a long time, where they had not existed previously. So with limited numbers of archive staff and a very small project staff and limited description, certainly there are still stories existing in the archives that were not surfaced and that we still don't know about. And while we've invested in more resources to get those materials processed, we do not have enough resources to work through all of the collections that have accumulated over the decades of university history. Further, it's important to keep in mind that description of archival collections is not a neutral act. Staff bring their own worldview to that work, which requires continual, purposeful reframing of our descriptive activity. And it also might mean that across time, descriptions that were made years ago or descriptions that are made today will not resonate 50 years from now. And then finally, we want to enable use. The whole point of a university archives is enabling use. Now that might be by the institution, perhaps, but also it doesn't mean a thing if we can't provide access to researchers to use the collections. So, and as I mentioned, without description, enabling use requires time-intensive mediation. Even with effective description, as well as preservation and sometimes digitization, archivists are still needed to retrieve the collections, offer assistance with research strategy, suggest other relevant materials, and essentially be active research partners, and they certainly were in the case of this project. I'll also point out, as Kacie often shares, that research activity had just taken off when the pandemic hit. And because most of the things in the university archives had not been described or digitized, there was a limited amount of work that the project's researchers could do without coming into the archive. So at a time when many of our peer institutions were keeping their archives closed to the public, our staff were able to open ours with limited hours so that this project and other archival research could proceed. So those are my comments about sort of archival practice and some of the background that happens behind this. I would say that I'm no longer a practicing archivist, and I'm no longer involved in the day-to-day activities in our university archives. I hope I haven't misrepresented anything, and I'm sure our archivists will let me know if there was anything. But I hope I've given you a small introduction with some considerations that go into archival work and what goes into supporting the kind of research that's necessary for a project like this one. I'd like to turn it over to Troy now for his thoughts about oral history. And Troy, in particular, I hope you can tell us about a few ways that the archives can go about filling in the gaps and create story or capture stories through that don't occur through regular records management-based ways that the University Archives is already accumulating.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for reminding me this is recorded, too. I had to cross off some of the four-letter words that I was going to use. So I'm Troy Reeves, he, him pronouns. I am the oral historian at the UW-Madison Archives and Records Management Services. What stories don't get told? You mentioned hierarchical. So the oral history program, when we started as a project, was just as hierarchical as the University Archives was. Very much interviewing old white guys who were administrators or faculty. We did that because we were created to help write the 4th volume of the University of Wisconsin history. So we were specifically earmarked to interview people who would help tell that story. What we have tried to do as a program and a project since then is try to be less hierarchical and try to get at these stories that don't get told. I like to say that oral history is the cure, not the band, The Cure. But that's not really true. I mean, oral history is as good as the people who do it. And that's why working with the Public History Project has been great, because Kacie from the beginning understood that oral history is best done when you're well-trained and well-prepared. So I had the honor and the privilege to work with Kacie and work with Kacie's students to talk to them about how to do oral history. So the other thing that the Public History Project has really done to help the oral history program and the archives is help to build or rebuild relationships. There's been a lot of things that the archives have done in the past that we wish we didn't do today, but it has been done. So Kacie and the Public History Project has been able to rebuild relationships. Now the challenge is going to be, if the Public History Project doesn't continue, how does the archives and the oral history program help to continue to build and rebuild those relationships? It's an open question. It's a question that we'll be dealing with really regardless of whether the Public History Project continues to exist or not. But that's the great thing about collaboration too, and collaboration from the beginning, is that Kacie and her students let us know how these relationships have been built, where there might be issues. So we hopefully will be able to pick up and continue those relationships that Kacie and her students have built and nurtured and fostered over the few years. So I'm going to talk here about the specific relationship with Kacie and the Public History Project. It's been the most fruitful collaboration that we have had at the archives in my 15 and a half years. I'm very much a quantifier. Today is my half birthday. I'm 15 and a half years at the University Archives. By far the most fruitful collaboration. But having said that, that collaboration, that fruit of labor is labor. So Kacie and her students will end up doing, what's the final, like 130?
Yeah, we're like almost
140? So 140 oral histories will be, some of them have already been transferred, we'll say, instead of donated, transferred to the University Archives. The bulk of them have yet to be transferred. So this is great. This is going to be great for the University Archives, great for the oral history collection. There is a lot of work left to do. 140 oral history interviews, I would guess that probably is about 1,250 hours of processing that's going to need to be done by the oral history program. And that number is low because the collaboration with the Public History Project, they have been doing a lot of the work that allows us to only have to do about 1,250 hours of processing work and making it discoverable and making it accessible. I don't say that to say I need more money. Sure, I mean, sure I do. Thank you, Lisa. But this is something that anything worth doing is worth doing well, but it involves labor. So even as a one-person full-time shop, so the oral history program just has one full-time person. I say we a lot when I talk about the oral history program. Yeah, and this is where my father's voice pops into my head, and I would say we a lot for some reason when I was growing up, and my father would say, "What do you mean by we, boy? You got a mouse in your pocket?" Which I didn't, by the way, because that would have been really weird.
And you shouldn't have one in the archive.
Yeah, true. That's a good point. So I say we a lot, and I have a great student staff, great collaborators, but it's really one full-time employee. And the archives has more than one full-time employee, but it is a small group, as Lisa mentioned, even though we are growing, gratefully and gracefully growing. So it took a village and takes a village from the oral history program and the archives to do this work. So I'm here, but I'm here because Katie Nash is not here. I'm here because Kat Fawn is not here. I'm here because Sarah and Mackenzie in records management aren't here. I'm here because students, including our student historian residents from the past few years, aren't here. I'm just one person representing the dozens of people who have been honored to work with the Public History Project over the years that we've worked with them. So before, am I going to turn it over to Kacie? Are we?
Oh, no, I've got,
Okay, then I want to say just one more thing
yep.
that I said at the Teaching and Learning Forum, and I want to say this every time I'm in community with Kacie. This Public History Project doesn't happen as well as it's happening without Kacie. It was the best hire, one of the best hires on this campus. This project should continue. Kacie should continue to work here. If she doesn't, we are losing a great voice and a great advocate for the work that we do, and not just at the archives, but the work of the university, the true work of the university. So I will say more when asked questions, but I'm going to now move it over to someone else.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Troy. So, Kacie, we've heard a lot about archival practice and the gaps that are likely to occur in archives, and then how we fill some of those gaps with things like oral history. But I was wondering if you could share with us how what we've talked about so far has impacted you and your team as you work to do the research and also to develop the exhibit, sort of in order to engage the public with the university's history, but like thinking specifically about all the work that hadn't been done, that needed to be done, that is being done, that still needs to be done.
Yes.
And how that supported or didn't support the project.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Kacie Lucchini Butcher. I'm the director of UW-Madison's Public History Project, she, her pronouns. Thank you for your kind words. Every time Troy says this, I get really emotional for some reason. Nobody else makes me this emotional. I don't know why, but thank you. So yeah, I remember my job talk here, and when I came for my job talk and my tour, and one of the parts of the tour was a tour of the archives with Katie Nash. And she like walked me around. It was my first thing in the morning. It was like 8 a.m. I was really nervous. And she showed me kind of some of the collections and what I'd be working with. And she was really honest. She was like, honestly, I think one of the biggest challenges of this project is not the exhibit or the website. Like, you'll find lots of support there. I think the biggest struggle is going to be researching. Our archives have run as an archive that was like mostly resources, like how we could answer questions, not how we could make this information accessible or easy to find. But we will do everything we can to support you. Like we're confident we can support you. We're here, but there's going to be significant challenges. So I knew that coming in, but I will say, you know, knowing coming in and then arriving is like two different things. So I had some experience doing archival research before I got here, but I'm a public historian. And so we really balance archival research with, I often say public historians love capital H historians because we like to make their work public. We want to take your 300-page book and get it into, 500 words so that the public can actually engage with your ideas, right? Because most people are not going to read your 500-page monograph about whatever you write about. And so when I got here, we did the kind of initial research review and connected with a lot of the published material about the university. Katie sent me this email right away that had the 4-volume Curdy. I read all of those. I don't know if I'm like one of the only people in the world who's read all 4, like from cover to cover. But I was like, I better learn. We did that kind of review, and then I started slowly digging into the archives with what I thought were going to be like obvious questions or easy areas to look into. And what I found right away was that the archives are very hierarchical. And so the best collections that we have are presidents' papers, chancellors' papers, deans, vice chancellors, provosts, any people in power. We have every letter that they've ever received and sent, and they're organized alphabetically. We have like so much detail, it kind of makes your head spin. And then we would pull a box on Black Greek letter organizations, and we'd find one piece of paper. And so the contrasts were stark right away. Another example I always like to use is that when we were researching blackface and minstrelsy on campus, we actually stopped researching at a certain point because it felt like a bottomless pit. We could not stop finding photos of blackface in our archive. And so we intentionally stopped looking for them because we had hundreds of photos, and we decided as a research unit, like, what would 100 more actually show us? So we had to move on to other topics. So that kind of stark contrast of what is available and easy to find and what is really difficult. And we managed this with the archives, I think, in like true partnership, where when we hit those roadblocks, it would be like me and some of our graduate and undergraduate students really brainstorming with archivists in the moment about, okay, we're trying to find, the records on UW-PD and we're falling short, but we know they have to exist here. And so we got really creative with, okay, who do they report to? And like, maybe they're under this dean. And like, sure enough, they rolled up under some dean. They roll up under the vice chancellor of business and finance for some reason. There were all the records that we were looking for, right? This rich record was there. And so that kind of creative problem solving with the archives was really important. The other thing that we got lucky, I think timing wise, was when we first arrived, the archives were actually going through and looking through the entire collection box by box to figure out what was there, what was missing, what could be deaccessioned. And when they did that, they just started pulling boxes. So I would come into the archive and Sarah would roll me over a cart and she said, okay, so this box is labeled discrimination. This box is labeled Negro problem. This box is labeled, Black students. And so she would just pull any box that they thought I'd want to see. And so we actually found a lot of incredible stories that way, where they would just open a box and say, I think you want to see this folder. So we pulled the box for you. So it really was this kind of like great partnership. And from the beginning, I knew that oral history was going to be important. I just like oral history because I like talking to people. And I had done oral history in other projects before, but I realized as soon as the archival collection started posing challenges that we were going to want oral histories to supplement the archive, but more importantly, and the basis for this project was really centering the voices of marginalized people. So you'll see in the exhibit that oral histories are like a central component to the exhibit. There are quotes everywhere. A lot of those were collected through oral histories that our project did. A lot of them were collected through the Color of Drinking study, which also used oral histories as a methodology to collect student experiences. And we wanted to foreground that. And I think that was part of the way that I personally have always felt deeply uncomfortable with like the capital H historian view of the world that says that I know what this history is and I'm going to tell you what it is. And here's all my arguments so you believe what I believe. I really like this collaborative kind of, okay, here's a lot of history, here's a lot of views of the past, here are the voices of people who were there and experienced it, and what can we kind of make of that together? What does that mean for us collectively? And how do we look at the process of making history as a collective act? And so I, very much like Troy, sit up here and I'm always very honored to be the face of the Public History Project and to get to lead this effort. But there are hundreds of people who made the Public History Project possible, including the archives, but also graduate students and undergraduate students, local community members and researchers, my assistant director, Taylor Bailey. We worked really collaboratively to bring this all together. And in particular, we got a lot of support from student organizations about how they wanted this history told, what they thought this history could do for the campus community. And so the archival challenges were ones that I think will continue to exist. And also the process of facing those challenges actually taught us all a lot. So like Lisa said, we have a better understanding of our university archives now. Like we learned so much about where things exist and where they don't exist and what you can find in those boxes. We also learned a lot about what we need to gather in the future and how we're going to go about doing that, whether that's through oral history or forming better relationships with student organizations or alumni groups so that we aren't facing these problems in 20, 30, 40 years. And I let everybody know that we are also creating a UW Public History Project collection because we will not be repeating the errors of the past either. So people will be able to access a collection about our materials as well so that in 20 or 30 years, people will know about the Public History Project too. I'll leave it at that because I'd rather answer questions.
Yeah, I think we all now would rather answer questions. So with that, I want to see what kind of questions you have.
Should I answer that first question that you asked?
Let's go ahead and answer that one.
So I think one of the things I talk about all the time with our project is that nobody else in higher education is doing this in the way that we're doing this. We do not know of a single other institution in the United States or internationally that is doing the work in the way that we are. So other institutions who've done critical histories like Harvard or UVA or Georgetown, they focus on a very specific research question, the institution's connection to slavery. We intentionally decided at the beginning to look at everything. I say that, and there's historians in the room. We can't look at everything. But we tried. We really, when we set out, we wanted to make sure that multiple different types of people on campus would see themselves reflected in the history because they're not usually seeing themselves in UW's history. So we wanted them to go in, and even if it was one story, to say, that's me, that's my community, that mirrors my experience of this institution. And so a lot of it was dictated, though, by the archival record and what we could actually tell. So we've gotten like a great question in our inbox just a few weeks ago about Hawaiian students on campus. And there was a very famous Hawaiian student here who was a graduate student and then went on to become like a leading scholar in the field. And somebody was like, oh, have you done research on her? I had never heard her name before. And so now I'm like, I want to go back and find her in the archive. Like maybe she is there in the department records, or maybe she is in the yearbook, but it hadn't come up in the normal kind of research pathways that we had looked for. And so like that's a group that's not represented. Faculty and staff, that's one of the big gaps in the exhibit that you'll see. It's because faculty and staff issues, particularly as they relate to discrimination, are considered HR issues. And so those records are not available in our UW archives always, and they're kept differently, and they're like a different retention schedule. And so we only have stories of faculty and staff discrimination if they rose to the level of the newspaper or if somebody sued the university. And so that's a huge one that we're missing that we hope to actually get back through oral histories, because we've had people reach out and say, you should talk to this woman because she was the first woman in the chemistry department, and I bet she has a story to tell. And so then we kind of reach out and we're like, hi, we're the Public History Project. And so we know that we can reach those back, but they're just so hard to get at, because another thing too, like if you have a bad experience, sometimes people just leave, they don't even say anything, they just go somewhere else. So it was a really difficult challenge. And so a lot of the communities that we covered were dictated by the archives or by the collections. And the other thing I'll say is that every exhibit has a big idea, and it keeps all of it bounded so that it doesn't become like everything in the kitchen sink. So when you go through Sifting and Reckoning, even though it's a lot of information, I hope you can see that there's a thread through it all. And that's how we kind of kept everything in line. And so there were some other stories we wanted to tell, but we held them all up against the big idea before deciding. And our big idea was, in the face of discrimination, marginalized communities fought to change the culture of UW-Madison. So there were stories that we ended up deleting, for example, a history of diversity plans at UW, because they don't center marginalized people. Diversity plans are made by usually white administrators. They are decreed down to marginalized communities without any input. That's what the history showed us. And so we ended up deciding to cut those in favor of telling a different story about the 1969 strike. We wanted to really emphasize the great risk that students went through and the great loss that they went through to make this university better. So we were making those kind of decisions all the time about not only who and what groups to cover, but what stories we wanted to tell so that we could, get the impact that we were hoping for. But we know there are communities missing. So we want to keep doing the work to kind of fill in those gaps eventually.
Thanks. Oh, we got all kinds of questions.
And the Public History Project, for those of you that don't know, was originally a 3-year project. That's why they keep talking about wanting to continue it, because it was funded for 3 years. Is that correct, Kacie?
It was funded for 3, and then the pandemic happened, and we got to extend our funding to 4. So the Public History Project is set to end in July of 2023 right now.
Hi, I'm Shay Corliss, she, they pronouns, and I am a student at UW Parkside, and I'm actually doing my final thesis on the exhibit.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so and particularly I'm interested in the performative narrative of the exhibit. And through my research, it's become apparent that how information is displayed through text and images can influence how an audience responds to it emotionally. So you touched on this a little bit, but could you talk a little bit more about the decisions that were made to cultivate like the emotional narrative within the exhibit, or was there an intent to do so, or was it just more information based?
I think, most public historians will tell you it is really storytelling, like Lisa said. It's about like making really good narratives for people to like hook them into the story. And so I actually really struggled with like graduate students who worked for me. I would be like, oh, like try your hand at writing this in 200 words. And I would get like the word intersectionality in there. And I'm like, no, no. Or like, you know, it would be like in the fall of 2022, blah, blah, blah. And it was just very formalized. And so getting them to think like narratively is actually something that you're not really taught in grad school if you're not doing something that's public facing like this. And so for us, it was, yes, informational, but like we're doing storytelling. And so there's a natural emotion to that. But I also think the stories are emotional. Like it would be so cold, and the cold clinical approach you'd have to take to suck the emotion out of some of these stories would be like a feat almost to me, I guess. And so there definitely was an emotion there. When we were writing the exhibit, we were balancing how difficult and heavy the histories were going to be with also providing moments of brevity and joy and community, right? That it would be disingenuous to tell a story about all this discrimination and not talk about resistance, but also not talk about the way that like people find community and like foster community in spite of this place and what is the culture created here. And so we were trying to always balance that, which I think provides an emotional kind of like antidote, right? So that it's not all heavy, that you get the light, you get those moments. The other thing is and public historians are really good at this. We're always like navigating this line, but you have to know who your audience is and what they can handle. And so we knew that our primary audience was primarily white people. This is a primarily white campus. It's an overwhelmingly white city. The viewership of the Chazen is overwhelmingly white. And so we've gotten the kind of critique of, you know, I wish you would have gone further. I wish you would have gone harder, been more critiqueful of this moment, this story, this thing. And we could have, absolutely. And also we were kind of figuring out like what was the line that we could walk people up to without making them break or crumble. Because if you have audiences who come in and they get overwhelmed and they shut down, you lose them and they'll leave. They'll walk out, they'll send angry emails, they won't come along with you. And so we were thinking about this as like an emotional journey for our viewers and trying to change minds, right? Trying to bring people along with a new perspective, a new image of the university, a new vision of the university's past without shutting them down, without making them scared or angry, without getting them to back down, I guess, which is a really tough line to walk, but is an emotional line, right? About the way that we've told the stories. But I think there is a lot of emotion in the exhibit, and that was intentional, I think. We wanted it to be emotional.
Yeah, so what's really interesting about this question is the performative aspect because, and I don't know how deeply we want to go into this, but the archives doesn't have that narrative layer on it. Mm-hmm. What you run into in the box is, like, so first of all, there's the description that happens in a finding aid, which can feel sort of clinical, but also sometimes when people are writing, they do pull narrative in there, especially in scope and content notes. But then when the researcher actually gets into the box, there's no filter. You're just faced with the stuff in the box. And so there's a lot of emotional labor that goes into the research, but also into the processing of archival collections when there's, you know, harmful things in the collections. And so in some ways, processing or researching can be a certain level of emotion and trauma.
And we had to deal with that. Troy and I have talked a lot about this. We talked a lot about trauma-informed oral history because a lot of the people that we interview, I mean, they're relaying really terrible traumas to us, like really racial attacks that have happened to them or like things like that. But also we had to navigate that with our students because, yeah, we had graduate students researching blackface for like 4 hours a day, you know, like, and a lot of our students would want to intentionally do that. Like our students were mostly students from marginalized identities who wanted to research this because they were so passionate about bringing these stories forward. But at the same time, I had to balance like, okay, take a break. It's okay to like, you could take the day off, right? And like, I tried to model that. So, you know, the only time I've ever cried in an archive was reading the purge papers at UW. They were like the worst thing to read. It's like men begging for their lives, basically, and the university just being very cold and clinical. And so I just like took the rest of the day off, right? But thinking about that and how we can like build space for our students to do that. But then we digitized all these materials for the website. So we have over 300 digital assets is what we call them to the public, but just different materials from the archive. So newspapers, letters, photos, videos, and a student had to process those and had to write descriptions of all of those and get them into the system, into the UW-DC, the UW Digital Collection. And I talked to her afterwards, and she was like, it was really hard, like, because she had to look at these photos and these letters and these newspaper articles all day, right, for hours. And so there's like a lot of the emotional labor in it too, which I'm sure you just can't separate from the way that the exhibit was written as well.
Yeah. Should probably get to some other questions, but thank you for that one.
That's a good one. I've never been asked that before.
Hi, my name is Beth Schaefer, pronoun she, her. July is going to be here before we know it. And this isn't the first time we've seen Kacie talk about this wonderful exhibit. I know timing was key. If there hadn't been a pandemic, there wouldn't have been the space at the Chazen. And also, Becky Blank really, really wanted this to happen, the previous chancellor. So, thinking about resources and knowing that this is a land-grant institution, I'm wondering what, now maybe Chancellor Mnookin is going to step in and have some role, and she's obviously got a fairly full plate. What do you know about things people can do to support the future of the exhibit in some form? Whether it has to get divided up and put in different departments, I hope not. Probably the Chazen wouldn't be its permanent facility.
No.
But what thought, if you're willing to conjecture, I'd be very interested.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the project was always conceived of as like short term, and in particular, truthfully, a solution to the Klan problem. Like there was the Klan report, and we had this big Klan controversy, and they said, we'll get these recommendations, we'll cross them off one at a time, and then we'll move on. And it was always funny to me because when I got hired, they were like, this is a short-term contract.
Could you say more about the Klan part?
Yes, so our project came out of a report on 2 student organizations on campus that bore the name of the Ku Klux Klan. So the report came out in 2018. It suggested the Public History Project as one of its core recommendations. So we came out of that report. And basically their question was, you're focusing too closely on these 2 student orgs in the 1920s. There's a whole history here, obviously. Look at Sifting and Reckoning. But when they were like, you don't expect a contract past 3 years. That's what they told me. Don't expect it. You will be leaving. You have 3 years. And then it was like, well, you have 4 because of the pandemic, but this is not going to continue. It's laughable to historians. I knew from the beginning, because the premise was that we were going to look at our history once, put it up, take it down, and then never think about it again. And that it would just go away, or that people would magically access it. I don't know what the magical thinking was. But I think that it was such a new initiative and such a new project that there was also kind of a lack of vision of like, what does it look like past this initial products that we've put out? And so now we've been having lots of conversations with leadership about what does it look like to institutionalize all of your history? Because we institutionalize our good history. It's everywhere on campus. It's in plaques and markers. It's in the alumni magazine. It's on Inside UW. You don't have to look hard for good history about UW. We don't institutionalize all of our history, whether that's in the alumni magazine and like promotional materials, but also, in decision making, right? How are these difficult histories shaping departmental decisions, shaping administrative decisions? And so now we're having those questions. And to be honest, we don't have a lot of examples to look towards in higher education, because the process before was to have a university historian, usually located in the archives, and their sole job was to publish about the university, to write books, journal articles, maybe speak at a conference or 2, but not to do this public engagement work across the university. And so we're trying to figure out how to build that right now. One of the ways that you can support the project is obviously to come see the exhibit, tell your friends, tell your family, visit the website, share it out. But on our website and in the gallery, there is a feedback link as well as the chancellor's email. And so if you think the Public History Project should continue, you should please reach out to the chancellor and let her know that, because I think one of the things that's always been apparent to me is that this is not uncontroversial work, even though the Public History Project and Sifting and Reckoning, since its opening, have been very warmly received. Like, it's surprised me how warmly received it's all been. But that being said, it's not uncontroversial to say we want to keep looking into some of the worst parts of our history. And so I think chancellors want to say yes to this type of thing. I think Chancellor Mnookin wants to keep doing this work. but she needs the space to say yes. She needs to know that campus community find it useful, interesting, that they used it in classes, that it helped their community org, that it made them think differently about their alumni relationship to the institution. They need to know that this work isn't threatening to a lot of people in our campus community and that they see it as vital.
Right, and I would just add to that in addition, a lot of the work that goes into supporting such work. So part of a living future in this space is not just having the expertise in the public history program, I hope, but also people in the archives who can continue to process collections, can continue to describe collections, so that students and other researchers can continue to do this work as well, either in conjunction with the program or on their own. And so I think that's the other thing is sort of raising the profile of how the University Archives also contributes to this work in whatever form that it takes in the future. And so certainly mentioning that to administrators.
Yes.
Now, that comes from one of the administrators, so I'll just say that. But then also, if you're so inclined, either the program or the University Archives certainly benefit from endowments and funding. So that's another way you can think about it. And then also the faculty and deans on this campus, if they know that it's important, if they understand that they can then dig into their history, right? So I think that's the other thing is if your avenue is I'm a faculty member in a department or a school or college, just making sure that that you're sharing your great experience with the exhibit and your great experience here tonight, I think is going to be really helpful too. Oh boy, lots of hands, Libby. And we have 5 minutes. So,
I think
yeah.
first. All the way at the end.
Oh, but we need you to use
We need
the
it
mic.
for the recording.
Is this better?
Yes,
Yes.
great.
Okay. I was told about this place by my dad. He currently has dementia, and he is one of the freedom riders. He said we need to know our truths, where we come from, where we're going, and where we need to go, and what we have to be when we get there. And if this is the way to do it, then do it. The University of Chicago is not doing this. They're currently being slammed by, and I live down the street from them on 61st. There is a barrier right there on 61st, going back to Stone Island. I was raised on the bad side of it. So I saw the good with the bad from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I shouldn't even be here. They're getting slammed. UIC is being slammed. The whole entire state of Illinois is being slammed. Tell the whole thing how you got to be. And own it. It's okay. Because this in itself challenges what happened in Washington with the critical race theory thing. It challenges everything head on. And it runs through the Brown versus the educational system. It runs through everything. Just keep it honest and own it. Because if this is the history, I have to own my history. I am Native American. I am my whole family from New Orleans, Choctaw, Chickasaw. I have to own all of my family from the islands to the South, slavery to now. The good and the bad, it's okay. Because how else are you going to learn? And keep it permanent. Whatever you guys need to do, let me know. I will talk to the director at the VA because we have a lot of Native American, all kinds of ethnic, racial backgrounds of veterans coming through. And it's a thing that we will be here on this campus also seeking an education as well. So we are a part of this also as well. We also have a presence here and keep it. And don't deny anything because I am the family historian. I have a book it's like this thick. And I read it from the age of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 about JFK's assassination in grade school.
That is not a normal childhood. But I did learn about intersectionalism of discrimination, access, resources, and people working together as one. And I look at what's going on. I'll be 47 next year, February. And I'm looking at this like, where are we at? Where are we doing?
Yeah.
Who's going to connect all of us?
Yeah, that's so important. So thank you for speaking to the importance of the permanence of this project.
We can sneak one more in, right?
Yeah, I think we'll take one more, and then if you have other questions, I don't know if we have time to stick around, but definitely get those to us. Okay, we'll do two. Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Aryeh Karmi. What you didn't talk about or you didn't mention in your exhibition is Jewish resistance. In 1972, I registered the Jewish Defense League as an official student organization at University of Wisconsin, here in Madison, Wisconsin. That meant having to see Dean Ginsburg on a regular basis to make sure we followed all the rules and guidelines and all the rules involved in having a student group here. We were well covered by the Daily Cardinal, Badger Herald. When we had our demonstrations in civil disobedience, it was covered in the newspapers. Yet you completely ignore us, as if we don't exist. So the question is, I know you guys are not going to agree with the Jewish Defense League. We're a militant organization, no question about it. We fought in those days, in the 70s and 80s, in Madison here at the University of Wisconsin, but the press didn't pay attention to us. There was even a Pulitzer Prize winner from a journalist won a prize, a photographer won a prize from covering our demonstrations. But you pretend with your exhibition that there was no Jewish resistance at all. So the question is, why do you ignore us after all these years?
It wasn't, I'm sorry that it's not included. We couldn't include everything. That is the shortest answer, is that we had 3,000 square feet to cover 175 years of history across all these different forms of discriminations and communities. So it was so difficult to make decisions about what ended up in the gallery and what didn't. It wasn't an intentional thing to not include Jewish people. And in fact, we include a lot of stories about Jewish history in the exhibit because we do feel that that's important, and because it's contributing to a current conversation on campus about discrimination against Jewish people. So it wasn't intentional in that way. It's just a problem of not having enough space to tell those stories. And really, I think one of the biggest struggles in the project was that we were given 2 years to research the entirety of the history of discrimination on campus, and we were given 3,000 square feet to tell it all. And so part of the kind of problem of our team was it felt like feast or famine. You get one shot to tell all these histories. How are you going to tell them all? And the sad answer is we couldn't tell them all. And so I think that that is a story that's important and should be covered. I'm sorry it wasn't covered this round, but we're hopeful that if we get to keep doing the work, we get to keep telling more stories.
Yeah, so thanks for entering that into the space.
I also believe in the permanence of the exhibit, and I wonder if there might be spaces in the libraries because, you know, as digitization occurs, the stacks are disappearing and there's more space for study, but perhaps there might be a location somewhere on campus. And then also this new State Historical Society building on the Capitol Square, maybe that might be another spot to consider.
Yeah, thank you for that. So actually, I will say that Kacie came to me possibly before going to Amy and asked about space in the library to do an exhibition, and we knew that they were going to want to put archival materials out, and we have no secure space or cases for that sort of space. So we do have a facilities master plan, and that facilities master plan would include renovation of several of our facilities, including Memorial Library, Steenbach College. And I would hope, and these are far down the line, but I would hope that a renovation would bring an exhibit gallery of some sort where we could do that. But that's not in the near future, unfortunately. But yeah, we couldn't put it in the library because we didn't have appropriately secure space. Did I get that whole question?
There are conversations ongoing about the students who saw the exhibit like 2 days before it opened. We brought student leaders through. The first question they asked was, why isn't this permanent? And there were a bunch of leaders in the room, and I was like, So we're having conversations about that right now, about what it looks like to either find a permanent location for the entirety of the exhibit, which I put an asterisk on that because I would really want to update it regularly, like maybe once a year, so that people have new reasons to come all the time. Because otherwise, like if you've seen it, why would you just keep coming back? And the other thing that we've talked about, if that doesn't work out, is splitting the histories up across campus, right? To find like what athletic stories go to athletics, what stories about student activism go over to the student activity center, what stories about the union go to the union, or a mix of the two of those would be great as well. But we are having those conversations right now.
So thank you all so very much for your comments and your insights and your questions. I wish this was a couple of hours longer. I think that it's been a really rich discussion. I imagine there are all kinds of questions you didn't get to ask. So please reach out to us. You can certainly find Kacie's information on the Public History Project website. And certainly my information is, and Maria's letting us know that there's the QR code on the back. And then, of course, you can get in touch with the libraries by going to our website. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you for viewing the exhibit. And thank you for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you.